The loneliest people are not always the ones without family. Sometimes they are the ones whose families have already decided they no longer matter. I did not understand what Richard Whitmore meant the first time he said those words. At the time, I simply smiled, adjusted the blanket over his legs, and reminded him it was time for his afternoon medication. My name is Sarah Bennett, and for almost 6 years I worked as the private caregiver for one of the wealthiest men in America. Before I met Richard, I imagined billionaires lived surrounded by people, laughter, and endless visitors. Instead, I found an 82-year-old man living inside a beautiful estate just outside Boston where the silence seemed larger than the house itself. The mansion overlooked a quiet lake, surrounded by towering oak trees and perfectly trimmed gardens that looked as though they belonged in a magazine. Every morning I arrived just before 7 o'clock. I prepared breakfast exactly the way Richard liked it: oatmeal with fresh blueberries, black coffee, and 1 slice of whole wheat toast. We followed the same routine nearly every day. Physical therapy in the morning, reading after lunch, a slow walk through the garden whenever the weather allowed. Some people would have called the routine boring. I never did. There was something peaceful about caring for someone who appreciated kindness more than conversation. Richard was never demanding. He thanked every housekeeper by name. He remembered birthdays. He asked about my mother after she recovered from surgery, even though I had only mentioned it once months earlier. Behind the headlines about billion-dollar companies and luxury investments was simply an elderly man who noticed the small things everyone else overlooked. What I could never understand was why his own family almost never came to see him. During holidays, expensive floral arrangements arrived with elegant handwritten cards signed by his son Ethan and daughter Victoria. Sometimes expensive gift baskets appeared at the front door, but the people themselves rarely did. Months would pass without a single visit. Occasionally one of them would stop by for less than an hour, usually after speaking with Richard's attorney or financial advisor. They always seemed to be in a hurry. They asked polite questions about his health, glanced at their watches, and left before dinner. Richard never complained after they drove away. He simply watched their cars disappear through the front gates before asking me if I wanted another cup of coffee. One rainy afternoon, while we sat in the library listening to the sound of rain against the tall windows, I asked him whether he wished his children visited more often. He closed the novel resting on his lap and looked toward the fireplace instead of answering immediately. Finally, he smiled, but there was sadness behind it. People make peace with different things, he said quietly. Some make peace with regret. Others never do. Then he changed the subject and asked about a book I had recently borrowed from the public library. That was Richard. He always redirected attention away from himself. Yet every few weeks, usually late in the evening after I helped him settle into bed, he repeated another sentence that stayed with me long after I left the room. One day, everyone will finally know who truly belonged here. At first I assumed he was speaking about family reconciliation or unfinished business. Perhaps he hoped his children would eventually rebuild the closeness they had lost over the years. I never questioned him because caring for someone often means respecting the conversations they are not yet ready to finish. As the seasons passed, his health slowly declined. Walking became more difficult. Reading tired him more quickly. Some mornings he needed help with simple tasks he once insisted on doing alone. Still, his mind remained remarkably sharp. He remembered every anniversary, every employee's name, every detail about the companies he had built decades earlier. More importantly, he remembered every promise people had made him, even the ones they believed he had forgotten. Looking back now, I realized there were clues everywhere. The locked drawer in his study that he never allowed anyone to open. The old photographs he sometimes held for several minutes before quietly returning them to the same leather box. The way he occasionally stared across the lake with an expression that was neither sadness nor happiness, but something far more complicated. I thought I was witnessing an old man reflecting on a long life. I had no idea I was standing in the middle of a story that had been waiting decades for someone willing to uncover the truth. Trothio dung yu ka, dui de la fan tu dui dang mot koi van ban due not. Sua. During the final months of Richard's life, our daily routine became quieter, but somehow more meaningful. His doctors visited more often, new medications appeared on the kitchen counter, and our walks through the gardens gradually became shorter until they were replaced by afternoons spent beside the large windows overlooking the lake. Richa, Richard passed away quietly 3 days after Christmas, just before sunrise, while the first light reflected across the frozen surface of the lake outside his bedroom window. There were no dramatic final words, because he had already said everything he wanted me to remember. I simply sat beside him, holding his hand until the room became completely still. After the doctor confirmed his passing, the estate that had always felt peaceful suddenly became strangely unfamiliar. Staff members moved quietly through the hallways. Telephones rang almost nonstop. Floral deliveries began arriving before noon. News stations parked outside the front gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of anyone entering or leaving the property. Within 48 hours, Richard Whitmore's death had become national business news. Yet inside the mansion, all I could think about was the empty chair beside the library window, where he had spent so many afternoons reading while I prepared tea. The funeral was private, exactly as Richard had requested. Only close family, longtime employees, and a handful of business associates attended. Ethan and Victoria stood together during the service, greeting guests with polished smiles and carefully chosen words. They thanked everyone for coming and accepted countless condolences, but I noticed they rarely spoke about Richard himself. Most conversations quickly shifted toward the future of the Whitmore. Companies, board meetings, and financial responsibilities. Charles Monroe remained quietly in the background, speaking very little while observing everything. Before leaving the cemetery, he approached me with the same calm professionalism he had always carried. "Sarah," he said gently, "the reading of the will is scheduled for Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Richard specifically instructed that you must attend." I nodded. I promised him I would. Charles gave me a thoughtful look before adding, "Bring the envelope. You will know when it becomes important." Those words stayed with me throughout the weekend. The sealed envelope remained exactly where I had placed it inside my desk drawer at home. More than once I found myself staring at it, wondering what could possibly be inside. Every instinct told me to open it, yet every memory of Richard reminded me why I should not. Monday arrived gray and cold. Snow covered the sidewalks outside Charles Monroe's law office in downtown Boston. When I entered the conference room, nearly everyone had already arrived. Ethan sat near the head of the polished oak table reviewing documents on his tablet. Victoria quietly spoke with two financial advisors. Several executives from Richard's companies occupied seats along one wall, while a few longtime household employees sat together near the back of the room. I chose a chair beside the window, keeping Richard's sealed envelope inside my handbag exactly as he had instructed. Charles entered precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying a thick leather binder. The room fell silent almost immediately. He thanked everyone for attending before explaining that Richard's final wishes would be read exactly as written, without interruption. The opening sections sounded predictable. Charitable donations. Longtime employees receiving generous gifts. Personal belongings distributed among friends and staff. Richard had remembered everyone with remarkable care. Then Charles reached the section concerning the family trust. Ethan straightened in his chair. Victoria folded her hands expectantly. Charles adjusted his glasses and continued reading in an even voice. "The remaining portion of my personal estate shall be divided according to the provisions outlined herein. A significant share shall be placed into a protected trust established for my beloved niece, Grace Harper." The room became completely silent. I looked instinctively toward Ethan and Victoria. Both wore the same expression of absolute confusion. Ethan frowned first. "Excuse me," he interrupted. "There must be some mistake." Victoria slowly shook her head. Richard did not have a niece named Grace Harper. Charles calmly looked up from the document. "I assure you there is no mistake. The name appears repeatedly throughout the executed will, along with supporting legal documentation." Several people around the table exchanged puzzled glances. One executive quietly whispered to another. A housekeeper I had worked beside for years looked as bewildered as I felt. I searched my memory, trying to recall whether Richard had ever mentioned anyone named Grace. Nothing came to mind. Charles continued reading, but my attention remained fixed on those three words. Grace Harper. The mysterious sentence Richard had repeated so often echoed once again inside my mind. One day, everyone will finally know who truly belonged here. For the first time, I realized that day had finally arrived, and whatever truth Richard had protected for so many years was only beginning to reveal itself. The silence inside the conference room lasted only a few seconds before it shattered into overlapping voices. Ethan leaned forward with visible disbelief. "There is no Grace Harper in this family," he said firmly. "I have reviewed our family records more than once. Whoever that person is, she has no legal connection to my father." Victoria nodded immediately. "I agree. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding or clerical mistake." Charles Monroe remained perfectly composed. He closed the leather binder for a moment and folded his hands on the table. "I understand your surprise," he said calmly. However, Richard Whitmore anticipated this exact reaction. He instructed me to continue reading without alteration and without speculation. "Every provision contained in this document has been reviewed, verified, and executed according to the law." Ethan shook his head. "You expect us to believe my father secretly had a niece that no one in this family ever met?" Charles looked directly at him. "I expect everyone in this room to respect your father's final instructions." The room fell quiet again. I remained in my chair without speaking, my handbag resting beside me. Inside it, the sealed envelope suddenly felt much heavier than before. Richard had known this moment would happen. Every promise he had asked me to make had led to this exact room, this exact conversation. Charles reopened the binder and continued reading. "The trust established for Grace Harper shall remain protected until her identity has been verified according to the documentation prepared during my lifetime." Victoria let out a quiet breath of frustration. "Verified by whom?" Charles answered immediately. "By me." His confidence unsettled everyone. It was obvious he knew far more than he intended to reveal. After several additional sections concerning charitable foundations and corporate governance, the formal reading concluded. Instead of standing to leave, Charles looked directly at me. "Miss Bennett," he said, "would you please remain seated?" Several people turned toward me with puzzled expressions. Ethan frowned. "What does Sarah have to do with any of this?" Charles did not answer him. Instead, he waited until the room gradually emptied. Within a few minutes, only the five of us remained. Charles, Ethan, Victoria, me, and one longtime financial advisor who quietly organized several legal folders before stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Charles finally looked at me again. "Richard left you something, did he not?" My heartbeat quickened. Without speaking, I reached into my handbag and carefully removed the cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. The moment Charles saw it, he gave a slow nod. "Thank you for honoring your promise." Ethan stared at the envelope. "What is that?" Charles answered before I could. "The next step." He handed me a small silver letter opener resting on the conference table. "Richard instructed that you open it only after the reading had reached this point." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the wax seal for the first time. Inside were several neatly folded pages, an old black and white photograph, and another smaller envelope with a handwritten address on the front. The photograph immediately caught my attention. It showed a much younger Richard standing beside a smiling young woman, holding a little girl who could not have been older than 4. All three of them stood in front of a small white farmhouse somewhere in the countryside. Richard looked decades younger, yet unmistakably the same man. On the back of the photograph, written in his familiar handwriting, were only 6 words. "The beginning of everything we lost." I looked up at Charles in confusion. "Who are they?" He slowly shook his head. "Richard wanted you to discover that answer yourself." I unfolded the first page of the letter. It began with a single sentence written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. "Sarah, if you are reading this, then everyone has finally heard the name Grace Harper, but they still do not understand why." I continued reading silently while the room around me seemed to disappear. Richard explained that the photograph was the first clue, not the final answer. He instructed me to travel to the address written on the smaller envelope before revealing anything else to anyone, including his own family. As I lowered the pages, Ethan stood abruptly. "Enough secrets," he demanded. "If my father wanted us to know something, then we deserve to hear it now." Charles met his eyes calmly. "Your father believed the truth had to be found in the right order. He trusted Sarah to complete the journey he could no longer finish himself." At that moment, I realized Richard had never intended the will to end the story. It had only been the beginning of a search that would lead far beyond the walls of that conference room. The address Richard had written on the smaller envelope led to a town I had never visited before, nearly 2 hours north of Boston. Early the next morning, I packed the photograph, the letters, and a notebook before starting the drive, while a light layer of snow still covered the roads. During the entire trip, Richard's words echoed in my mind. He had trusted me to finish something he no longer could. That responsibility felt heavier than I had expected. The address belonged to a modest white farmhouse surrounded by maple trees and an aging wooden fence. It was nothing like the enormous estate where Richard had spent his final years. A weathered mailbox stood near the driveway, and the name Harper was painted carefully across its side. I parked my car and remained seated for a moment, wondering how a place so ordinary could be connected to one of the richest men in the country. Finally, I walked to the front porch and knocked gently. After several moments, the door opened. A young woman with light brown hair and thoughtful blue eyes looked at me with polite curiosity. She appeared to be in her mid-20s and wore a thick knitted sweater with faded blue jeans. There was nothing about her that suggested wealth or privilege. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. I suddenly realized how impossible my visit must sound. "My name is Sarah Bennett," I replied. I was the private caregiver for Richard Whitmore. Her expression remained unchanged. The name clearly meant nothing to her. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not think I know anyone by that name." I took a slow breath before carefully removing the old photograph from my folder. "I was hoping you might recognize someone in this picture." She accepted it with both hands and studied it quietly. Her attention immediately settled on the young woman standing beside Richard. I noticed the slightest change in her expression. "That looks like my mother," she whispered. She looked up at me, confused. "Where did you get this?" I explained only the parts one believed Richard would have wanted me to share. I told her about caring for him during the final years of his life, about the reading of his will, and about hearing her name spoken inside a room full of people who had never met her. She listened without interrupting, though disbelief slowly replaced her initial curiosity. When I finally mentioned that Richard had referred to her as his niece, she quietly shook her head. "There has to be some mistake," she said. "My mother passed away 8 years ago, and she never once mentioned anyone named Richard Whitmore." Before I could respond, she invited me inside from the cold. The farmhouse was simple but welcoming. Family photographs covered one wall of the living room, showing birthdays, school graduations, and holiday dinners. As I looked more closely, I realized the smiling woman in those pictures was the same young woman from Richard's old photograph, only older. Grace noticed where I was looking. "That is my mother, Emily Harper," she said softly. "She raised me by herself. We never had much money, but she always made sure I had everything I needed." I reached into the folder again and unfolded another page from Richard's letter. Near the bottom was a sentence I had not fully understood until that moment. It read, "If Grace tells you she never knew me, believe her." That was my choice, not hers. I handed the letter to Grace. She read the sentence twice before lowering the page. "Why would someone choose to stay hidden?" she asked quietly. I did not have an answer. Instead, I looked around the room again and noticed something resting on a small bookshelf beside the fireplace. It was a silver music box with delicate blue flowers painted across the lid. I had seen that exact music box once before. Years earlier, while dusting shelves in Richard's study, I had asked whether it had belonged to someone special. He had gently smiled, closed the lid without answering, and returned it to the locked cabinet. Standing inside Grace's living room, I suddenly realized there had never been two identical music boxes. There had only ever been one story, carefully divided into two separate lives, waiting for someone to place the missing pieces back together. Grace carefully set the music box on the kitchen table between us, as though it were far more valuable than its worn paint suggested. She ran her fingers gently across the faded blue flowers before looking back at me. "My mother never let me play with this," she said softly. "She always kept it on the highest shelf and only took it down once every year on my birthday." She slowly lifted the lid. A gentle melody filled the quiet farmhouse, and for a brief moment I was no longer standing in Grace's living room. I was back inside Richard's study years earlier, watching him win the very same tune before quietly closing the lid with an expression I had never understood. My heart began to race. "Grace," I asked carefully, "did your mother ever explain where she got this?" She slowly shook her head. She only said it came from someone who once made her a promise. Those words matched something Richard had said during one of our conversations almost 3 years earlier. We had been sorting old books in the library when he quietly remarked, Some promises are easier to keep from a distance than up close. At the time, I believed he was reflecting on business decisions or old friendships. Now I wondered if he had been speaking about Emily Harper all along. Grace stood and walked toward an old wooden cabinet near the dining room. After searching through several neatly organized boxes, she returned carrying a faded blue scrapbook. My mother kept everything, she explained with a small smile. Letters, school papers, newspaper clippings. She could never throw memories away. Together we carefully turned each page. Most of the scrapbook contained ordinary family moments, but near the middle we discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside a plastic sleeve. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "For Emily, if you ever choose to read it." Grace frowned. I have never seen this before. She hesitated before looking at me. Do you think I should open it? I remembered Richard's respect for personal choices. It belongs to you now, I answered quietly. Only you can decide. After taking a deep breath, Grace carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated almost 28 years earlier. As she began reading, tears slowly formed in her eyes. She handed the pages to me when she could no longer continue. Richard's handwriting was unmistakable. He explained that Emily Harper had once worked as a young assistant in one of his charitable foundations after losing both of her parents at an early age. Over time, he had come to think of her as the daughter he never had, while she jokingly called him Uncle Richard because of the guidance and encouragement he gave her during difficult years. There was no hidden scandal, no secret affair, no shocking family betrayal. Their bond had been built entirely on kindness, trust, and chosen family rather than blood. Years later, when Emily became seriously ill shortly after Grace was born, she refused Richard's financial support because she wanted to raise her daughter independently. Richard respected her decision, but he quietly arranged scholarships, anonymous donations, and medical assistance through trusted charities so neither Emily nor Grace would ever know where the help truly came from. The final paragraph explained everything I had struggled to understand. If Grace is reading this, then I was unable to tell her myself that family is sometimes created by love instead of shared blood. I never wanted gratitude. I only wanted her future to remain untouched by my name or my fortune. Grace covered her mouth as tears rolled gently down her cheeks. My mother always told me that strangers had helped us when we needed it most, she whispered. She never knew it was the same person. I quietly unfolded the old photograph once again and placed it beside the letter. For the first time, every piece finally fit together. Richard had never invented a mysterious niece. He had simply chosen to recognize the young woman he had loved like family after life separated them in different directions. Grace looked at me with red eyes, but a peaceful expression. What happens now? She asked. I thought about Charles Monroe waiting in Boston, Ethan and Victoria demanding answers, and Richard's final wish that the truth be discovered in the proper order. I carefully returned the letter to its envelope before meeting Grace's eyes. Now, I said softly, we go back and finish the story exactly the way Richard wanted it to be told. The drive back to Boston felt very different from the one that had brought me to Grace's farmhouse. I was no longer chasing unanswered questions. I was carrying answers that had the power to change how an entire family remembered Richard Whitmore. Grace sat quietly in the passenger seat with the blue scrapbook resting carefully on her lap. Every few miles she looked out the window, lost in thoughts that neither of us felt ready to interrupt. I understood exactly how she felt. Less than 24 hours earlier, she believed she was an ordinary woman whose mother had struggled through life with quiet dignity. Now she had discovered that someone she had never met had quietly protected her future for nearly 3 decades without asking for recognition or gratitude. As we approached the city, my phone rang through the hands-free system. Charles Monroe's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Sarah, I was hoping you would call, he said in his calm voice. Did you find her? I glanced toward Grace before replying. Yes, and I think I finally understand what Richard wanted everyone to know. Charles remained silent for a brief moment before speaking again. Then bring everything with you. Richard prepared one final document that cannot be presented until Grace is present herself. We agreed to meet the following morning at his office. That evening, Grace stayed in one of the guest rooms at the Whitmore estate because she had never visited Boston before and the weather forecast warned of heavy snowfall overnight. Walking through the mansion with her felt strangely emotional. She stopped often to admire the artwork, the grand staircase, and the peaceful library overlooking the frozen lake. When we entered Richard's study, she immediately noticed the framed photographs covering one corner of the room. Her eyes settled on a familiar face. "That is my mother," she whispered. I walked beside her and looked more closely. It was a photograph I had somehow overlooked for years. Emily Harper stood beside Richard during the opening ceremony of one of his charitable education centers, both of them smiling proudly, while several children stood nearby, holding new backpacks. The small engraved plaque beneath the frame simply read, "Kindness changes generations." Grace gently touched the edge of the frame. "He kept this here all these years." I quietly nodded. He never stopped thinking of her as family. Later that night, after Grace had gone upstairs, I returned to Richard's study alone. Sitting behind his old desk felt almost impossible because I could still imagine him looking out across the lake while planning one more charitable project or reading one more history book. As I organized the letters and photographs for the morning meeting, I noticed one final folded page tucked inside the back cover of the scrapbook. It had apparently slipped behind another photograph earlier. Across the top, Richard had written, "If Sarah has reached this page, then she has already found Grace." I unfolded it carefully. The letter explained that Ethan and Victoria had never known Emily because she entered Richard's life after both of them had already become adults and moved away. Richard intentionally kept his private charitable work separate from his business and family life because he never wanted acts of kindness to become public displays or sources of obligation. Emily had respected that decision completely. After her passing, Richard quietly continued honoring the promise he had once made to her by supporting Grace anonymously through educational grants administered by independent foundations. He ended the letter with words that immediately brought tears to my eyes. "My children will inherit everything I built with my hands. Grace will inherit the promise I built with my heart. Neither gift diminishes the other because love is never divided when it is given honestly." I folded the page slowly and placed it beside the other documents. For the first time since Richard's passing, I understood why he had trusted me instead of explaining everything himself while he was alive. If he had simply announced the truth years earlier, people might have mistaken kindness for obligation or questioned his motives. Instead, he allowed his life, his letters, and his choices to speak together after he was gone. As the snow quietly began falling outside the study windows, I realized the final chapter of Richard Whitmore's story would not be about a mysterious inheritance at all. It would be about proving that the strongest family bonds are sometimes created not by blood, but by a lifetime of promises faithfully kept. The following morning, the snowfall had stopped, leaving Boston covered beneath a quiet blanket of fresh white snow. Grace and I arrived at Charles Monroe's law office just before 9 o'clock, carrying Richard's letters, the old photograph, the scrapbook, and the small music box that had unexpectedly become one of the most meaningful pieces of evidence. When we entered the same conference room where the will had first been read, Ethan and Victoria were already waiting. Their expressions immediately changed the moment they saw Grace walking beside me. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply watched as Charles invited everyone to take their seats. Once the room became quiet, Charles placed another sealed folder on the polished oak table. "Richard instructed me to continue this meeting only after Sarah completed the journey he described in his private letter," he said calmly. "That instruction has now been fulfilled." Ethan folded his arms. "Then let us finally hear the explanation." Charles nodded before looking toward Grace. "Miss Harper, before anything else, I want you to know that Richard never expected you to prove yourself to anyone in this room. He believed the documents would speak more honestly than any argument." Grace quietly thanked him and remained seated with both hands resting on the scrapbook. Charles began by presenting copies of Richard's handwritten correspondence with Emily Harper spanning nearly 30 years. Each letter documented their friendship, his role as a mentor, and his decision to support educational charities that quietly benefited Emily and later Grace without revealing his identity. There were legal trust agreements signed years before Richard's health declined, financial records showing anonymous scholarship funding, and sworn statements from independent trustees confirming that every arrangement had been created long before the final will. No single document seemed dramatic by itself, yet together they formed an undeniable record of decades spent honoring one promise. Ethan carefully reviewed each page, without speaking. Victoria slowly turned through the old photograph album before stopping at the picture of Richard and Emily standing together outside the education center. Her expression softened for the first time since the reading of the will. "Why did he never tell us?" she asked quietly. Charles answered with gentle honesty. "Because Richard believed kindness loses something when it becomes public recognition. He wanted Emily to live with dignity, not gratitude." The room remained silent as those words settled over everyone. Finally, Charles unfolded one final handwritten letter marked simply, "To my family." His voice remained steady as he read aloud. Richard explained that wealth had allowed him to build companies, foundations, and opportunities for countless people. But the relationship he treasured most outside his own children had been the trust Emily placed in him when she was struggling to rebuild her life. He wrote that he never replaced her parents, never attempted to become anything other than a dependable presence, and never expected anything in return. After Emily passed away, he continued protecting Grace's future because a promise should not disappear simply because one person is no longer alive to hear it. Then came the final paragraph. "If you are listening to this letter, I ask only one thing. Do not measure family by surnames, inheritance, or public appearances. Measure it by who quietly remained faithful when no one was watching. Grace never asked for my help. Sarah never asked for my trust. Both received it because they earned it through honesty rather than expectation." When Charles finished reading, no one spoke for several long moments. Ethan slowly removed his glasses and looked toward Grace. "I spent my entire life believing I knew every important chapter of my father's story," he admitted. "I was wrong." Victoria turned toward Grace with tears in her eyes. "I am sorry that the first time we met had to happen like this." Grace smiled gently through her own emotion. "I never came here expecting money," she answered softly. "I only wanted to understand why my mother's photograph was in a stranger's letter." Charles carefully closed the leather folder. Richard believed that question deserved an honest answer. Looking around the room, I realized the tension that had filled it only days earlier had quietly disappeared. There were still emotions to process and legal details to complete, but suspicion had been replaced by understanding. Richard had not used his final wishes to divide his family. He had used them to reveal a truth that could only be appreciated after every missing piece had finally been placed where it belonged. Over the following weeks, the legal work continued exactly as Richard had planned years before. Every document was reviewed, every trust was verified, and every charitable foundation remained exactly as he had intended. Despite the confusion that had surrounded the reading of the will, there were no hidden surprises left to uncover. Richard had anticipated every question, preserved every record, and left behind a trail of honesty that was impossible to challenge. Grace accepted the trust established in her name with quiet humility. She insisted that the money would first be used to preserve the scholarship programs Richard had created because, in her words, they had already changed lives long before they changed hers. Ethan and Victoria agreed without hesitation. For the first time since I had known them, they spoke less about inheritance and more about responsibility. During one meeting at the Whitmore Foundation headquarters, Ethan quietly admitted that he had spent years assuming his father measured success only through business achievements. "Now I realize," he said, looking at one of Richard's old photographs hanging in the conference room. He measured it by the people whose lives quietly became better because he showed up when they needed someone. Victoria smiled sadly before adding, "I wish we had asked more questions while he was still here." No one disagreed with her. A month later, Grace asked if I would accompany her back to the small farmhouse where she had grown up. Together, we carefully packed her mother's scrapbook, Richard's letters, and the blue music box into protective boxes before placing them on a shelf in the living room where future generations could easily find them. "These belong together now," Grace said softly. "They tell the same story." I looked around the simple farmhouse and realized how remarkable Richard's final gift truly was. He had not used wealth to impress anyone. He had used patience, loyalty, and quiet generosity to keep a promise that lasted nearly 30 years. That promise had eventually connected two homes that had never known each other existed. Before I left, Grace handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for believing a stranger enough to finish someone else's promise." I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my purse beside my own family photographs. Some things deserve to stay close. Several months after everything had settled, I returned to the Whitmore estate one final time. The mansion had become noticeably quieter without Richard's gentle presence filling its rooms. Yet something felt different. The silence no longer carried loneliness. Instead, it carried gratitude. Ethan had chosen to keep the library exactly as his father left it. Victoria had expanded one of Richard's educational charities in Emily Harper's honor. A new scholarship now carried both of their names, ensuring that students facing financial hardship would receive opportunities without ever feeling indebted to the people helping them. As I walked through the familiar garden overlooking the lake, I paused beside the bench where Richard and I had spent countless afternoons watching the changing seasons. The oak trees still reflected across the water exactly as they always had. For a moment, I could almost hear his calm voice reminding me that people often notice the largest victories while missing the quiet ones that matter most. I finally understood what he meant each time he said that one day everyone would know who truly belonged there. He had never been talking about legal titles, bloodlines, or fortunes. He was talking about loyalty, compassion, and the courage to keep a promise long after it became inconvenient. Looking back now, I realize I was never simply hired to care for an elderly billionaire during the final years of his life. I had been entrusted with protecting the last chapter of a story built on kindness that expected nothing in return. Richard's greatest inheritance was never measured in dollars, companies, or property. It was measured in the lives he quietly lifted, the promises he faithfully honored, and the truth he refused to let disappear after he was gone. That is the legacy I carried with me when I walked away from the estate for the last time, knowing that some families are connected by birth, while others are connected by the extraordinary choice to love, protect, and remain faithful when no one else is watching.